It was a typical day for Mark, one of those crisp fall mornings when the chill in the air added a bounce to his step. As he strolled through the city streets, he had come to dominate in the world of real estate. Everything seemed perfect. His career was soaring, his investments multiplying, and his name carried weight in every corner of the industry. Success had been his constant companion for years, and today was no different. Mark paused at a coffee shop, enjoying the usual rush of recognition from the baristas, who knew him by name. The scent of roasted beans filled the air as he stepped back outside, sipping his coffee, savoring the familiar feeling of accomplishment. Life, as far as he was concerned, had blessed him. Yet something gnawed at him deep inside, a small, unshakable emptiness that all his wealth and success couldn't quite fill. As he waited for his driver near the corner of a busy street, his eyes lazily scanned the familiar scenery. The city was alive, bustling with people rushing to work, carrying out their daily routines. It was a city he had come to know intimately, though today something seemed different. Suddenly, across the street, a figure caught his eye. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the woman hunched on the cold sidewalk, surrounded by ragged blankets. She was just another face in the crowd, another casualty of the city's unforgiving nature. Mark had seen countless homeless people in his life, many of whom he passed without a second thought. But there was something about her, a strange, inexplicable familiarity that tugged at him. He took a closer look, his heart skipping a beat as his mind started to piece together what his eyes refused to believe. The woman's hair, though matted and streaked with gray, reminded him of someone. Her posture, the way she shielded herself from the world, hiding under layers of worn clothing, triggered a long-buried memory. Mark's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the pavement as the realization hit him like a freight train. That woman, the one crouched on the street in desperate need, wasn't just any homeless person. It was Sarah, his Sarah, the girl he had loved with every fiber of his being as a young man, the girl he had promised to come back for all those years ago. His mind whirled with disbelief. Could it really be her? The Sarah he remembered was vibrant, full of life and hope, with dreams as big as his own. They had grown up together in a small town, inseparable for most of their childhood. They had planned to build a life together, to escape the constraints of their modest upbringing and conquer the world side by side. But life had taken them on different paths. Circumstances had torn them apart, and though he had thought about her often, he had never imagined finding her like this, homeless, broken, and unrecognizable. Mark's chest tightened as he crossed the street without thinking. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the noise of the bustling city around him. How could this have happened? What had led Sarah to this point, and how had he not known? As he approached her, she didn't notice him. Her eyes were downcast, focused on the ground as if the weight of the world had crushed her spirit. Mark hesitated, unsure of what to say or how to approach her. What did you say to someone you once loved, only to find them living on the streets? A flood of emotions washed over him: guilt, shame, sadness, but most of all, disbelief. Sarah. His voice cracked, barely a whisper. She didn't respond at first. For a moment, Mark thought he had been mistaken, that his mind had conjured up a ghost from the past, desperate to see what wasn't there. But then, slowly, she lifted her head, her hollow eyes meeting his. The moment their eyes locked, time seemed to freeze. The years melted away, and for a brief second, Mark saw her as she had been, beautiful, with a fire in her eyes that had once captivated him. But that fire was gone now, replaced by something far more tragic. She looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion, as if she couldn't quite place him. "It's me, Mark." His voice was shaky, uncertain. He wasn't sure if he should have approached her like this. Maybe she didn't want to be reminded of the past, of what they had once shared. Sarah's face remained blank for a moment longer, and then recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by something else, something darker. It wasn't the warm, joyful recognition Mark had expected. Instead, It was cold, detached, as if seeing him brought up memories she had worked hard to bury. "Mark," she whispered, her voice hoarse and brittle, as if it hadn't been used much lately. "Mark. From home." He nodded, the lump in his throat growing larger. This was not how their reunion was supposed to go. In his mind, he had always imagined seeing her again someday, but she was supposed to be happy, successful, just like him. They were supposed to have a joyful reunion, reminiscing about old times and laughing about where life had taken them. Instead, he was staring at a woman who had been beaten down by life in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. How? How did this happen? The words tumbled out before he could stop them, but he immediately regretted asking. It wasn't the right question. Not now. Sarah's eyes dropped again, her hands clutching the edges of her tattered coat. "It's a long story," she said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. Mark knelt down beside her, his heart aching as he saw how frail she had become. He couldn't let her slip away again. Not like this. "Sarah, I want to help. Let me help you." But Sarah shook her head, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "You can't help me, Mark. No one can." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman he had known would never have given up so easily. She had always been strong, determined. What had happened to her? "I don't believe that," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Whatever happened, we can fix it. I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that ran deeper than he could ever understand. "You don't know what you're asking, Mark. You don't know what it's cost me. What it would cost you." "What do you mean?" He was desperate for answers now, the fear gnawing at him. What secret was she hiding? Sarah stood up, gathering her meager belongings. "It's better if you don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. Mark stood up too, refusing to let her walk away this time. "Sarah, please, don't shut me out. I've thought about you so many times over the years. I never forgot you." She paused, turning to face him. For a moment, the old Sarah seemed to flicker to life in her eyes. "I never forgot you either," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But the person you remember, she's gone, Mark, and you're better off forgetting her." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded streets, leaving Mark standing there, his mind racing with questions. As he watched her fade into the distance, one thing became clear. He couldn't just walk away. Whatever had happened to Sarah, whatever secret she was hiding, he was determined to find out. But deep down, he feared that uncovering the truth would cost him far more than he was prepared to lose. Mark couldn't shake the image of Sarah from his mind. The woman he had seen on the street, so broken and distant, was not the Sarah he remembered. The Sarah he had known was vibrant and full of life. She was the girl who had believed in him when no one else did, the one who had shared his dreams of leaving behind their small town and making something of themselves. But now, that person seemed like a distant memory, replaced by someone who had lost everything, including hope. For the next few days, Mark's thoughts were consumed by the encounter. He tried to focus on his work, but every time he sat down to handle a deal or meet with clients, his mind drifted back to Sarah. He replayed their conversation over and over, dissecting her words, her expressions, the way she had looked at him with a mixture of recognition and sorrow. What had happened to her? Why was she so resistant to his help? And what was this terrible secret she was carrying? Mark's curiosity quickly turned into obsession. He needed to know more. He couldn't just let her walk out of his life again, not without understanding what had brought her to this point. He had the resources to help her, the connections to turn her life around. He just needed to find her again. He started by asking around. Mark had a network that extended across the city, from the high-powered business executives he dealt with regularly to the lower-level workers who ran the day-to-day operations of his properties. He made discreet inquiries, asking if anyone had seen a homeless woman fitting Sarah's description. He didn't mention their history. He kept it vague, framing it as a general concern for someone who seemed to be in trouble. Days passed without any leads, and Mark's frustration grew. The city was massive, and the homeless population was transient, moving from one place to another depending on the day or the weather. Still, he refused to give up. Something about Sarah's situation felt personal, like it was a puzzle he was meant to solve. He couldn't explain why, but he knew deep down that reconnecting with her was important, not just for her sake, but for his own. Finally, one evening, he got a call from one of his security personnel. The man had seen a woman matching Sarah's description near an abandoned warehouse downtown, a place where many of the homeless sought shelter. Mark didn't waste a second. He grabbed his coat and headed out into the cold, darkening evening. The warehouse was in a part of town Mark hadn't visited in years, a place far removed from the polished world of luxury real estate and fine dining he had grown accustomed to. The buildings were old and dilapidated, with graffiti covering the walls, and the streets littered with trash. It was a stark contrast to the glimmering skyscrapers and high-end stores just a few miles away, a reminder of the city's sharp economic divide. Mark parked his car a few blocks away, not wanting to draw attention. He walked the rest of the way, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the warehouse, he saw small groups of people huddled around makeshift fires, wrapped in layers of clothing to keep warm. The sight was a harsh reminder of the world he rarely had to face, the world that Sarah now belonged to. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of her. His heart raced as he saw a familiar figure sitting near the entrance of the warehouse, her back against the wall, her head bowed. It was Sarah. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment, Mark just stood there, unsure of what to do next. He had imagined this moment over and over in his head, but now that it was here, he felt paralyzed. Gathering his courage, he approached her slowly. Sarah. She didn't look up right away. For a second, Mark thought maybe she hadn't heard him, but then she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no surprise on her face this time, only a weary resignation. "You're back," she said flatly, as if she had been expecting him. Mark nodded, feeling awkward. "I've been looking for you." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Why? What's the point, Mark? You should have just walked away the other day. I told you, there's nothing you can do for me." Mark crouched down beside her, ignoring the stares of the other people nearby. "I can't just walk away, Sarah. I need to know what happened to you." She sighed, pulling her coat tighter around her. "What difference does it make? I'm not the person you knew anymore. That girl you remember, she's gone." "I don't believe that," Mark said softly. "You were always stronger than anyone I knew. You had dreams, goals. We both did. What happened?" Sarah didn't respond for a long time. She stared at the ground, as if trying to decide how much she should tell them. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "After you left, after we lost touch, things went downhill. I tried to keep going, to make something of myself like we always talked about, but it didn't work out that way." Mark could hear the pain in her voice, but he needed more. He needed to understand. "What happened, Sarah? I know there's more to it than that." Sarah clenched her jaw, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I got involved with the wrong people. I made some bad choices, trusted the wrong person. And well, here I am. That's all there is to it." Mark frowned, sensing that she was holding something back. "That's not all. There's something else, isn't there? You mentioned a secret, something that could ruin me if I got involved." Sarah stiffened at his words. "Mark, please, just leave it alone. You have no idea what you're asking." "I'm not leaving until I know the truth," Mark insisted. "I want to help you, but I can't do that if you keep shutting me out." Sarah stared at him, her eyes searching his face for a moment, as if she was trying to decide whether she could trust him. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "You don't understand. This isn't something you can fix. The people I got involved with, they're dangerous, Mark. If they knew you were trying to help me, they'd come after you too." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. Dangerous people. What had Sarah gotten herself into? His mind raced with questions, but before he could say anything, Sarah spoke again. "I was working for a company," she began, her voice trembling. "A big one. They seemed legitimate at first, but they were involved in some shady stuff. Embezzlement, fraud, you name it. I didn't know at first, but by the time I figured it out, it was too late. I was already in too deep." Mark felt a knot forming in his stomach. "What happened?" "They made me take the fall," Sarah said bitterly. "They needed a scapegoat, and I was the perfect candidate. They threatened me, told me that if I didn't cooperate, they'd ruin my life. And they did. They took everything from me. My job, my reputation, my future." Mark was speechless. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sarah had been caught in a web of corporate corruption, used and discarded by people far more powerful than her. It explained so much. The fear in her eyes, the coldness in her voice. She had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. "Why didn't you come to me?" Mark asked quietly. "I could have helped." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't want to drag you into this. You had your own life, your own success. I didn't want to be the one to ruin that for you." "But you didn't deserve this," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of it." Sarah looked away, her expression hardening. "Maybe I did. I made bad choices, Mark. I should have seen the signs. I should have known better." Mark shook his head. "No, this wasn't your fault. Those people took advantage of you, but I can help you now. We can expose them, take them down together." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "You don't know what you're saying. These people are dangerous, Mark. If you go after them, they'll come after you too. They'll destroy everything you've built." Mark's heart raced as he listened to her, but he couldn't walk away. He had to do something. "I don't care about that. I care about you." Sarah stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "You should care, Mark. You've got too much to lose." With that, she stood up, gathering her belongings once more. "I appreciate that you came looking for me, but you need to let this go. I don't want your help. It's better if you just forget about me." Mark stood there, watching as Sarah walked away again, disappearing into the shadows of the city. His mind was reeling with everything she had told him, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let her go. Not again. No matter what it took, he was going to find a way to help her, even if it meant risking everything he had. Mark's mind was a whirlwind as Sarah disappeared into the shadows for the second time. Her words echoed in his head, the weight of her story sinking in deeper with each passing moment. She had fallen into a trap far beyond anything he could have imagined. Corporate corruption, threats, and the ruin of her entire life. Yet, the thought that Sarah was out there, alone and afraid, while he had the power to help, gnawed at him relentlessly. He couldn't just turn his back on her, even if she believed that dragging him into her problems would destroy him. The next few days were restless. Mark couldn't focus on anything. His work meetings, once a highlight of his days, became blurry, unimportant. The real estate deals that had once excited him now seemed trivial. He spent most of his time in his office, staring out the window, wondering where Sarah was. What was she doing now? Was she okay? And most importantly, how could he help her? Mark had built his entire career by solving problems, seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. This was no different, he told himself. He just had to approach it with the same mindset. Sarah had been a victim of something bigger than herself, and if she wouldn't let him help her directly, then he'd have to do it another way. He started by digging into the company she had mentioned. Sarah had been careful not to reveal too many details, but Mark had enough information to start piecing things together. Late into the night, he sat at his desk, scrolling through financial reports, news articles, and obscure business forums, looking for any mention of the shady dealings she had alluded to. After hours of research, he found it. An old news article about a financial scandal involving a company that matched Sarah's description. It was a brief piece, buried among dozens of other business news stories from years ago, but it mentioned fraud, embezzlement, and, most importantly, a scapegoat, a low-level employee who had taken the fall for the company's corrupt executives. Mark's heart sank as he read the article. The employee wasn't named directly, but he knew it was Sarah. She had been the one left to take the blame for the actions of her superiors, and now she was paying the price. But what troubled Mark even more was the realization that the scandal hadn't been fully exposed. The article hinted at ongoing investigations, but the trail had gone cold. The executives involved had never been held accountable. They had walked away free, their reputations intact, while Sarah's life had been destroyed. Mark knew what he had to do next, but the path forward was far from simple. He wasn't a whistleblower or an investigative journalist. He was a businessman, a very successful one, but this situation required something different. He needed to dig deeper, and to do that, he needed help. He called in a favor from an old college friend, David, who now worked as a private investigator. David had helped him on a few personal matters before, mostly involving background checks or discreetly handling business deals, but this was a much bigger ask. Mark explained the situation, carefully leaving out Sarah's name, and told David that he needed to uncover everything about the company involved in the scandal. David agreed, though he warned Mark that digging into something like this could have serious consequences. "You're playing with fire here, Mark. If these guys were willing to ruin someone's life to protect themselves, they won't think twice about coming after you if they find out you're investigating them." Mark understood the risk, but his resolve only hardened. "I don't care about that. I can handle whatever they throw at me. I just need to get the truth." A few days later, David returned with a file thicker than Mark had expected. As he flipped through the pages, the reality of the situation became clear. The company, once a rising star in the financial world, had been involved in a massive scheme to defraud investors. They had hidden losses, falsified records, and manipulated stock prices, all while making themselves rich. When the scheme had begun to unravel, they had needed someone to take the fall. And Sarah, a junior employee at the time, had been the perfect candidate. She didn't have the resources to fight back, and when she tried to blow the whistle, they had buried her under threats and legal pressure. Mark's blood boiled as he read through the details. The executives responsible were still out there, living comfortable lives, while Sarah was on the streets. It was infuriating. But what made it worse was the knowledge that Sarah had been trying to protect him from this. She thought he'd be ruined if he got involved, but Mark knew that wasn't true. If anything, his wealth and influence could be the key to taking these people down. But David's report wasn't all bad news. Buried within the pages was a crucial piece of information. One of the executives who had orchestrated the scheme had recently retired, and rumor had it that he had kept documents that could blow the entire case wide open. These documents were said to be hidden in a private vault, accessible only to a few people. If Mark could get his hands on those documents, he would have everything he needed to expose the company and clear Sarah's name. This was it. This was his way in. Mark had the resources, the connections, and now, thanks to David, he had a lead. But he also knew this wouldn't be easy. The people involved were powerful, and if they got wind of what he was doing, they wouldn't hesitate to strike back. Mark spent the next week carefully planning his next steps. He hired a small team of trusted advisors, people who had helped him with delicate matters in the past, to assist with the investigation. They were discreet, loyal, and knew how to handle sensitive situations. He also began quietly pulling strings in the business world, reaching out to contacts who could help him navigate the legal and financial intricacies of the case. But even as he moved forward, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Sarah had warned him to stay away, and he hadn't seen her since their last conversation. Part of him worried that she was in even more danger now that he was digging into her past. He had tried to find her again, but she seemed to have disappeared completely. One night, as he sat in his office, surrounded by files and legal documents, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. His heart raced as he opened it, hoping for some kind of lead on Sarah. The message was brief, but it sent a chill down his spine. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Mark stared at the screen, his mind racing. Who had sent the message? Was it one of the executives, someone who had caught wind of his investigation? He had expected pushback, but this was different. This was a direct threat. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He wasn't about to back down, not after coming this far. If anything, the message only confirmed that he was on the right track. But he also knew he had to be careful. Whoever sent the message was watching him, and they weren't bluffing. The next day, Mark met with David to discuss the threat. David wasn't surprised. "I told you this could happen, Mark. These people have deep pockets and they don't play by the rules. If you keep pushing, they'll come after you." Mark nodded, but his determination hadn't wavered. "Let them. I'm not stopping until I get those documents and clear Sarah's name." David sighed, but he understood. He had known Mark long enough to realize that once he set his mind on something, there was no turning back. "All right, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just go charging in. We need a plan." Over the next few days, Mark and David carefully orchestrated their next move. They decided to go after the retired executive who supposedly had the documents. He was a recluse, living in a heavily secured estate outside the city. Getting access to his vault wouldn't be easy, but Mark was willing to take the risk. As they finalized their plan, Mark couldn't help but think about Sarah. He hoped she was safe, that wherever she was, she hadn't been caught in the crossfire of his investigation. He needed to find her, to let her know that he was doing this for her, that he wasn't going to let her suffer alone any longer. But time was running out. The more Mark pushed, the more dangerous the situation became. He was about to go up against some of the most powerful people in the city, and if he wasn't careful, everything he had built could come crashing down. Still, he couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. As Mark prepared to take the next step in his plan, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. What if Sarah had been right? What if exposing the truth really did mean losing everything? But as he stood at the edge of a precipice, about to dive deeper into a world of corruption and deceit, Mark knew one thing for certain. He was willing to risk it all for Sarah. The stakes had never been higher for Mark. After receiving that ominous text message, he was on high alert, but he wasn't backing down. He'd spent his entire life building his fortune from the ground up, and while he valued the success he had achieved, he knew in his heart that this fight was about something far more important than money or reputation. It was about justice for Sarah. Days passed as Mark and David refined their plan. The target was clear: the retired executive, Roger Stanton. Stanton had been a key player in the financial scandal that had ruined Sarah, and from all accounts, he was the one with the hidden documents that could expose the entire fraudulent scheme. But Stanton was no ordinary target. He lived in a sprawling estate outside the city, fortified with private security and enough money to ensure that even the slightest threat to his comfort would be swiftly dealt with. Mark's contacts confirmed that Stanton rarely left his property. He was a paranoid man, always looking over his shoulder, likely because he knew the secrets he carried could destroy more than just his own life. Mark's challenge was getting close enough to uncover what he needed without tipping his hand too soon. One evening, Mark sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. He hadn't seen her in weeks, and the uncertainty of her safety gnawed at him constantly. He had tried to track her down again, using the same channels he had before, but it was as if she had vanished. Every lead turned up empty. It made him wonder if Sarah had gone into hiding, aware that his digging was stirring up more trouble than either of them could handle. Or worse, what if the people behind the scandal had already gotten to her? He shook the thought from his mind. No, he couldn't afford to think that way. Sarah had survived this long, and he was going to make sure she survived whatever was coming next. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting alongside her, even if she didn't know it yet. The next step in Mark's plan involved using Stanton's weaknesses against him. Through David's connections, Mark learned that Stanton had a daughter, Emily, who was recently engaged in planning a high-profile wedding. The wedding was set to take place at Stanton's estate, and it would be a lavish affair, complete with a guest list full of the city's elite. It was the perfect opportunity for Mark to get inside the estate undetected. He just needed an invitation. As luck would have it, one of Mark's business associates had ties to Stanton's family. After some delicate maneuvering, Mark managed to secure an invitation to the wedding as a +1 under the guise of networking with the city's top players. It was risky, but it was the only way to gain access to Stanton's vault without raising suspicion. The day of the wedding arrived, and Mark found himself standing in front of Stanton's sprawling mansion. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, blending in with the other high society guests. The estate was everything he expected it to be: grandiose, excessive, and secured by layers of private guards. Stanton spared no expense when it came to his security, but amidst the flurry of wedding activities, Mark hoped that the heightened security might be a little more relaxed. As the guests mingled, sipping champagne and discussing the latest business ventures, Mark stayed in the background, scanning the area for any signs of the vault. He knew from David's intel that Stanton kept his most important documents in a private study, located in the far wing of the estate. The study itself was heavily guarded, but the wedding provided the perfect distraction. Mark's plan hinged on finding a way to slip away unnoticed during the reception. Hours passed, and the reception was in full swing when Mark saw his chance. The guests were dancing, the bride and groom were surrounded by well-wishers, and the security detail was focused on keeping an eye on the main event. Mark excused himself from a conversation, making his way through the side corridors of the mansion until he reached the wing where Stanton's study was located. The hallway was eerily quiet compared to the noise and laughter of the reception. Mark's heart raced as he approached the door to the study, trying to stay calm. He didn't know what he would find inside, but he was certain it would lead him to the answers he needed. As he reached for the door handle, a voice behind him stopped him cold. "What are you doing here?" Mark froze, turning slowly to see a woman standing at the end of the hallway. It was Emily Stanton, the bride. She was holding her bouquet, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. For a brief second, Mark considered bluffing his way out, but then he saw something in her expression that made him pause. Fear. She wasn't just suspicious, she was scared. "I could ask you the same thing," Mark said, keeping his voice calm. "You're the bride. Shouldn't you be with your guests?" Emily glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was following her. I needed a break," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a lot, you know. All the attention." Mark didn't buy it. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands gripped the bouquet a little too tightly. She wasn't here for a break. She was hiding. But from what? He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Emily, listen. I know this is your big day, but I need your help. It's about your father." Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she looked like she might bolt. "What about him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he had to take the risk. "I know about the documents he's keeping, the ones that could expose everything. I'm not here to ruin your wedding, but I need to get into that study." Emily's face paled. "You don't understand. My father, he's not what you think." Mark's heart raced. He had expected Emily to deny everything, to defend her father, but instead, she seemed genuinely afraid. "What do you mean?" he asked, taking another step toward her. Emily hesitated, glancing back down the hallway. "My father, he's done terrible things. I've tried to pretend like it wasn't happening, like I didn't know, but I can't anymore. I thought today would be different. I thought maybe I could start fresh, leave it all behind, but—" She stopped, her voice cracking. Mark felt a surge of empathy for her. She wasn't complicit in her father's actions. She was trapped, just like Sarah had been. "You don't have to be part of this," he said gently. You can help me. We can stop him." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "It's too late. He'll never let me leave." Mark realized then that Emily was just as much a victim as Sarah had been. Stanton had manipulated everyone around him, using his wealth and power to control not only his business, but his own family. Mark couldn't let this continue, not for Sarah, and not for Emily. "Let me help you," Mark said, his voice firm. "I can get the documents. We can take him down together." Emily hesitated for a long moment, her gaze shifting between Mark and the door to her father's study. Finally, she nodded, her hands trembling as she handed him a key. "It's in the vault behind the bookshelf. There's a safe inside. The code is 1974. But please, be careful." Mark took the key, his heart pounding. "Thank you, Emily. You're doing the right thing." With that, he turned and entered the study, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The room was exactly as David had described, grand, with dark wood paneling and a massive desk dominating the center of the room. Mark wasted no time. He found the bookshelf and pressed the hidden lever that Emily had told him about. The shelf slid aside, revealing a small vault. Mark punched in the code, holding his breath as the door clicked open. Inside were stacks of papers, binders, and digital files, everything he needed to expose Stanton's crimes. He quickly gathered as much as he could, stuffing it into a briefcase he had brought with him. Just as he was about to leave, the door to the study swung open, and there stood Roger Stanton himself, his face twisted with fury. "You really thought you could get away with this?" Stanton snarled, stepping into the room. Mark's heart raced, but he stood his ground. "It's over, Stanton. I have everything I need to bring you down." Stanton laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think you're the first person to try and take me down. I've buried men stronger than you." Mark's mind raced as he calculated his next move. He had the documents, but Stanton wasn't going to let him walk out of here without a fight. The old man stepped closer, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're finished, Bennett. Everything you've built, everything you've worked for, it's all gone. You'll never win." Mark's grip tightened on the briefcase. "Maybe not, but neither will you." Without another word, Mark bolted past Stanton, sprinting down the hallway toward the exit. Behind him, he heard Stanton shouting for his security team. But Mark didn't stop. He had what he came for. And now, there was no turning back. As he burst through the front door of the mansion and into the cool night air, Mark knew one thing for certain. He had set the wheels in motion. Mark sprinted down the driveway of Stanton's mansion, his heart hammering in his chest as the sound of shouting echoed behind him. He didn't dare look back. His eyes were locked on the tall iron gates at the end of the estate's long, winding path. Beyond them lay the safety of the city streets, where Stanton's reach couldn't touch him, at least not immediately. His legs burned with the effort as he pushed himself harder, clutching the briefcase tight to his chest, knowing that everything inside it was the key to bringing Stanton down. The weight of the evidence felt both reassuring and terrifying. It was what he had been searching for, but it was also a ticking time bomb. The distant sound of footsteps pounding on the gravel told Mark that Stanton's security had been mobilized. He could hear voices barking orders, and the beams of flashlights cut through the darkness, bouncing erratically as the guards closed in. Mark's pulse quickened. He wasn't going to make it out the front gate. They'd catch him before he could slip away. He needed another exit. His eyes darted to the side, scanning the tree line that bordered the estate. The thick patch of woods lay just beyond the perfectly manicured lawns, dense enough to provide cover. Without hesitation, he veered off the driveway, heading toward the woods. The ground beneath him shifted from gravel to soft earth, and within moments he was plunging through the underbrush, branches snapping beneath his feet. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the guards continued down the main path, assuming he was heading for the gate. Mark's lungs burned with the cold night air, but he kept moving, zigzagging through the trees in case anyone was following him. The woods were darker than he expected, the thick canopy blocking out the moonlight. He stumbled over roots and rocks, but adrenaline kept him going. After what felt like an eternity, he finally slowed, crouching behind a large tree to catch his breath. The only sounds were the distant shouts of Stanton's men and the steady thrum of his heartbeat in his ears. Mark allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He had done it. He had the evidence, and he had escaped. But the reality of the situation quickly set in. He wasn't out of danger yet. Stanton wouldn't give up so easily. The man had resources, connections, and the kind of ruthless determination that didn't back down from a threat. Mark had hit him where it hurt, and there would be consequences. Once he felt confident that he wasn't being followed, Mark made his way out of the woods and back onto a quiet residential street. He called for a ride, knowing that returning to his car at the estate would be far too risky. As he waited for the car to arrive, his mind raced with 100 different thoughts. What would be the next move? How could he protect himself? And more importantly, how could he ensure that Stanton couldn't silence him before the truth came out? The ride back to his apartment was tense. Mark constantly glanced over his shoulder, half expecting one of Stanton's cars to appear in pursuit. But the streets remained quiet, and by the time he arrived at his building, the city felt eerily still. He hurried inside, taking the elevator up to his penthouse, locking the door behind him as soon as he stepped inside. For the first time in hours, Mark allowed himself to breathe. He set the briefcase on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long moment. Everything he needed was in there, but it was also a target. He knew that Stanton would stop at nothing to retrieve it. Mark poured himself a glass of water, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He couldn't waste any more time. He needed to act fast. He grabbed his phone and called David. Mark. David's voice was tense on the other end of the line. What happened? Did you get it? I got it, Mark replied, his voice steady but grim. But Stanton knows. His security's after me. We don't have much time. There was a brief pause before David spoke again. All right. We need to move quickly. I'll meet you at the office. We'll go over everything and figure out the next step. Mark agreed and hung up, quickly gathering the briefcase and a few other essentials. As he headed for the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. He had the evidence, but Stanton was far from defeated. The man had built his empire by crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way, and Mark had no illusions about how far Stanton would go to protect himself. When Mark arrived at the office, David was already waiting for him. They sat down in the dimly lit conference room, spreading the contents of the briefcase across the table. It was overwhelming at first. Pages upon pages of financial records, internal memos, and damning communications that painted a clear picture of Stanton's corruption. This is it, David said quietly, sifting through the documents. With this, we can take Stanton down. But we have to be smart about it. If we release this too soon, he'll bury us in legal trouble before we even get a chance to expose him. Mark nodded, his mind racing. What do you suggest? We need to go public, but not in a way that gives Stanton time to retaliate. We need to get this into the hands of someone who can protect the story. Journalists, regulators, people who have enough clout to shield us while the investigation unfolds. Once it's out in the open, Stanton won't be able to silence it. It was a solid plan, but Mark knew it wouldn't be easy. Stanton had his tentacles wrapped around every part of the city's power structure. Politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement. They all owed him favors, and if Stanton called them in, Mark could find himself facing charges, legal threats, or worse. As they continued poring over the documents, Mark's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He didn't recognize the number, but something in his gut told him to answer. He stepped out of the room, pressing the phone to his ear. Hello. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a familiar voice. It's Sarah. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from her since she disappeared, and the sound of her voice brought a wave of relief and anxiety all at once. Sarah, where are you? I've been trying to find you. You need to stop, Mark, she interrupted, her voice urgent. You need to stop whatever you're doing. It's too dangerous. Mark frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. What do you mean? I have the evidence. We can take Stanton down. No, Sarah said, her voice strained. You don't understand. He's coming for you. He already knows what you have, and he's not going to let you get away with it. Mark's pulse quickened. Sarah, I'm not backing down. I'm doing this for you, for everything they did to you. There was a brief silence on the other end, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was laced with fear. Mark, it's not just about me anymore. There are people involved in this, people far more dangerous than Stanton. If you push this too far, they'll come after you, and they won't stop until you're ruined. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. I'm not scared of them. I'm doing the right thing. Mark, please, Sarah pleaded, her voice breaking. I'm begging you. Don't risk your life for this. I've already lost everything. I can't lose you too. Her words hit him hard. He had expected Sarah to be on his side, to want justice as much as he did. But now, hearing the fear in her voice, he realized just how deeply the trauma of her past had scared her. She wasn't asking him to stop because she didn't want Stanton brought down. She was asking him to stop because she was terrified of what might happen to him. Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing. I can't let him get away with this, Sarah. Not after everything he did to you. We have a chance to make this right. There was a long pause on the other end, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost resigned. Then be careful, Mark. Please, just be careful. The line went dead, and Mark stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he was walking into dangerous territory, but he couldn't stop now. Sarah might be scared, but Mark couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Stanton needed to be exposed, and Mark was the only one who could do it. He returned to the conference room, where David was still going over the documents. We need to move fast, Mark said, his voice steady. Stanton's already making moves. David nodded, not missing a beat. I've got a few contacts in the press who can help. If we can get this story out to the right people, Stanton won't be able to suppress it. We just need to make sure we have all our bases covered. As they finalized their plans, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Stanton would come for him, just as Sarah had warned, but Mark wasn't backing down. He was ready for whatever came next. He had fought his way to the top before, and now he was ready to fight for Sarah, and for the truth. The next few days would be a whirlwind of decisions, dangers, and deception, but Mark was prepared. Mark barely slept in the days following his conversation with Sarah. Her warning echoed in his mind constantly, a reminder of the precarious position he was now in. Stanton was powerful, ruthless, and, according to Sarah, not even the worst of what Mark was up against. But he had come too far to turn back now. David had worked quickly, reaching out to trusted contacts in the media. A few key journalists, known for exposing corruption, had shown interest, but getting them the documents would be dangerous. Stanton's reach was everywhere. If he found out about the meeting before the story broke, it could end disastrously. Mark moved through his days cautiously, feeling the invisible eyes of Stanton's network watching him at every turn. He was sure his phone was being monitored and his movements tracked, but he couldn't let that stop him. The documents in the briefcase were the only leverage he had left, and he needed to use them before Stanton or his unseen allies made their move. The night before the meeting with the journalists, Mark sat in his apartment, staring out at the city lights, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His mind was racing with questions about the fallout. Would Stanton retaliate? Would he come after Mark's business, his family, or something even worse? And what about Sarah? She had been adamant about the danger he was in, but she had also been vague. What exactly had she meant by people more dangerous than Stanton? Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here than he understood. Sarah had been involved with powerful people, and while Stanton was a key player in the scandal, Mark knew there had to be others. People who had profited from the lies. People who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. They were the real threat, and the thought of crossing paths with them sent a chill down his spine. But despite the fear gnawing at him, Mark was resolute. He hadn't come this far to back down now. His whole life had been built on facing challenges head-on. And this would be no different. If Stanton and his associates thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were wrong. Early the next morning, Mark received a call from David. The meeting with the journalists had been arranged for later that night at a secure location. The plan was simple. Mark would hand over the documents, and the journalists would begin their investigation immediately. They would ensure the story was airtight before publishing, making it impossible for Stanton to refute the evidence. But as the day wore on, Mark's sense of unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. His instincts, honed from years of navigating high-stakes business deals, were screaming at him to be cautious. He knew Stanton wouldn't go down without a fight, and he couldn't afford to underestimate the lengths the man would go to protect himself. That evening, as Mark prepared to leave for the meeting, his phone rang. It was Sarah. "Mark," she said, her voice tense. "Please, you have to listen to me. You can't go to that meeting." Mark frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "Why not?" "This is the only way to expose Stanton. We have the evidence, Sarah. This is our chance." "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "They know about the meeting. Stanton's people, whoever he's working with, they're planning something. If you show up, they'll make sure you don't leave." Mark's stomach dropped. "How do you know this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm still in contact with them, Mark. I didn't have a choice. They've been watching everything. I heard them talking about you. They're going to stop you, whatever it takes." Mark's mind raced. He had expected resistance, but not something this direct. He had been so focused on Stanton that he hadn't fully considered the network of people working behind the scenes. Whoever they were, they had power, enough to control Sarah, enough to threaten him. "Sarah," Mark said, his voice firm but gentle, "you need to tell me everything. Who are these people? What do they want?" "I can't," she replied, her voice full of fear. "If I say too much, they'll come after me too. All I know is that they've been watching you since you started digging. They won't let you go public with this. They'll stop you before it ever sees the light of day." Mark's pulse quickened as he processed her words. He was being hunted, not just by Stanton, but by a much larger entity, an organization that operated in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. It made sense now why Sarah had been so terrified. She wasn't just worried about Stanton. She was afraid of whoever was controlling him. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Mark asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "If I don't go through with this, Stanton wins. They all win." "I don't know," Sarah said quietly. "But if you go to that meeting, you won't make it out. Please, Mark, find another way." Mark clenched his jaw, torn between his desire to expose the truth and the very real threat to his life. He had fought his way through countless obstacles to get to this point, but now he was faced with a choice that felt impossible. If he backed down, Stanton and his allies would walk away unscathed. But if he went forward with the meeting, he was walking into a trap, one that could cost him everything. "I'll figure something out," Mark said finally, his voice steady. "But I'm not giving up." He hung up the phone, his mind whirling with possibilities. He couldn't go to the meeting as planned. That much was clear. But he couldn't just sit back and do nothing either. He needed to find a way to get the evidence out, and fast, before Stanton's people closed in on him. Suddenly, an idea hit him. It was risky, but it was the only option he had left. Instead of meeting with the journalists in person, he would send the documents to them digitally, encrypted and secure. They could begin their investigation without him, and he would stay one step ahead of Stanton's men by disappearing for a while, laying low until the story broke. He called David immediately, explaining the new plan. David hesitated at first, clearly concerned about the risk, but he agreed it was the best course of action given the circumstances. They spent the next few hours setting up secure communication channels, ensuring the files would be delivered safely and without detection. By midnight, the documents were on their way to the journalists, and Mark was already packing a bag, preparing to go underground. He had planned for this possibility, knowing that once the story was in motion, Stanton's people would come after him. He couldn't be there when they did. As Mark left his apartment, he felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The evidence was out, and soon the truth would be too. But now he was a target, hunted by people with far more resources than he had. The days that followed were tense. Mark moved from place to place, staying off the grid as best he could. He changed burner phones frequently, never staying in one location for more than a night. He kept in contact with David, who reported that the journalists were working around the clock to verify the documents. The story was coming together, but it wasn't ready yet. They needed more time. Meanwhile, Mark felt the pressure closing in. There were moments when he was certain he was being followed, shadowy figures lurking in the periphery of his vision. Stanton's men were out there, and they were closing in. But Mark stayed ahead of them, always moving, always staying one step ahead. Then one night, as Mark lay in the dim light of a rented room, his phone buzzed with a message from David. It was a single line, but it was enough to make Mark's heart leap. The story's out. Mark sat up, the weight of the moment crashing over him. It was done. The truth was out there for the world to see. Stanton, his allies, and the entire network of corruption they had built would be exposed. There would be no silencing this now. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over yet. Stanton and his people would undoubtedly try to retaliate, and Mark would still have to watch his back. But the hardest part was done. The story was out, and there was no stopping it. As he stared out at the darkened city skyline, Mark couldn't help but think about Sarah. He had done this for her, but in doing so, he had uncovered something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. And now, for the first time in a long time, Mark felt hope. He would survive this, and so would Sarah.